Today we're going to talk about how the United States survived its experimental stage under our current Constitution. So the 13 colonies fought off the British in order to give the people in North America power to govern themselves, which is called popular sovereignty. Remember, one of the rallying cries of the American Revolution was no taxation without representation. And now that they have their independence, they're on to this grand experiment of trying to secure that popular sovereignty for the people. If you can remember from previous videos, they tried to do this where state governments would just become a loose confederation with a very weak central government to tie them all together. Well, they found that that doesn't really work, right? So now they have to move to the other end of the spectrum where they have to create a stronger central government to tie the state governments together, and where the state governments would have to be subordinate to this central government. This type of government that the Constitution created is a federal system where the state governments share power with the federal government. The Constitution also created something called a republic. But did you know that before the United States, before this Constitution of the United States in the 17th century, there was actually no other republic that existed in this sense? A lot of the framers of the Constitution read philosophers who were talking more about classical republics. And those republics existed more in ancient Greece, ancient Rome. Those are examples of those classical republics. And there were several characteristics for those governments. They were actually called virtuous republics because they were tied together and they had their power from virtue. Virtues were important in this government and in the way they ruled the people. These governments also ruled a small area or a small number of people, and the people that they ruled were homogenous, like all sharing the same culture and the same backgrounds and the same language. And finally, these small virtuous classical republics ruled a people that were unified for the most part. They were all of the same political mind. Now you get to the United States, and we weren't exactly like that in 1789 when the Constitution was first launched. So we were truly doing a grand experiment. A lot of the founding fathers weren't even sure that the government would last, but they were certainly determined to try. On June 22nd, 1788, when New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the Constitution, the current central government at the time, the Articles of Confederation Congress is what we call them, or the Confederation Congress, they went ahead and set a date for the new government to meet, and that would be March 4th, 1789. So when that date arrived, elected representatives and senators from the different states met at New York City's Federal Hall in order to answer all the lingering questions left by the Constitution and to enact and form a strong central government. So that first Congress had a full plate. They had to set up roles and rules and procedures for Congress. They had to establish the Departments of War, the Department of State, and the Department of Treasury. They also had to set up the communication system for the whole country. So they set up a temporary post office system. They also passed the Judiciary Act of 1789, which established the federal court system in the United States according to the Constitution, and they set up pay for government officials. And finally, one of their biggest tasks was to figure out the money problem. Yes, the money. So this time, the Constitution actually gave the government power and revenue to run itself. However, it did not really address how it would solve existing money problems. This new Congress inherited a big one. They inherited all the debts that the Articles of Confederation Congress had. In addition, they also had all the debts that the states had all the way from the American Revolution. And they had this problem of figuring out how to pay it all off. So the House of Representatives decided to give this task to Alexander Hamilton, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, and they asked him to create a report that would explain the credit of the country and where all the debts were, who they owed money to, and how much. and what they should do about it. And they didn't give him a lot of time to figure it out either. They met in September, assigned it to him in September, and they said, well, we're going to meet again in January and make sure you have that report ready by then. And that's only like 110 days. Alexander Hamilton researched the state of our debts, he became more and more overwhelmed. First, there was the issue of our national debt. A lot of them were direct loans, and we owed money to the French government directly. And we also owed a lot of money to individual bankers in Amsterdam, which was the finance capital of the world at that time. We also owed a little bit of money to the Spanish government. But we didn't just owe those bankers and countries the principal amount of the money. We also owed them interest. So that's what the national government, right, the country as a whole, owed to foreign entities. In addition, the Confederation Congress, as well as the Continental Congress before them, they owed money to the people within the United States. The soldiers, merchants, the farmers, everyone who had given goods and supplies to the war effort had not gotten paid yet. They were given promissory notes or bonds saying that, hey, this little piece of paper is an IOU. I, the American government, will give you money when I get it in exchange for these supplies that you're giving to me now. I'll pay you later. So there's that. There was all those debts that the national government owed to foreign entities and to its own people. But there was also the issue of state debts. Each state kind of operated as its own country more or less, and they had their own debts to foreign entities as well as domestic entities. And while some states may have paid those debts off, there were other states that still owed a lot of money. So in looking at these debts, the new national government had a few options. First, they could just completely start over and say, oh, hey, you know, those debts, they weren't really ours. We're a different government. We're new, so we can't pay you, right? And this would be a nice and simple solution because we could just completely wipe the slate clean and start over. But it would absolutely ruin the credit and trustworthiness of the new United States. Those foreign entities who lent us money, they're never going to lend us money again. Likewise, the people within our own country that lent the government money will never lend them money again, knowing that the promises they made in the past were broken. The solution that Alexander Hamilton eventually decided to go with was to just take on all of the debts, both national and state, and all of the interest so that it would bolster the credit of the national government. This way, they wouldn't be breaking the promises that they had made in the past, and they would start repaying all those debts. He also took on state debts so that the states would now have a tie to the federal government and would kind of owe the federal government something. Alexander Hamilton's thinking was that, hey, national debt is actually good here because the act of lending and borrowing money keeps that money circulating within the economy, and it's what keeps the economy afloat. He was also thinking then that, hey, all these people that we owe money to, that the national government owes money to, now they have a vested interest in making sure that the federal government succeeds, right? Because the federal government owes them money. So this is great. National debt is good. Because of this, he becomes known as the father of the national debt. At the end of the day, this national debt amounted to $75 million. I mean, $75 million is a lot of money now. Can you imagine how much money it was back then? So now the big question is, where will all this money come from? Regular taxes alone was not going to be enough to pay it all off. Alexander Hamilton had a couple of ideas. First, he thought, yes, let's go ahead and put a tariff on goods. And a tariff is that tax that you put on goods coming in from other countries. In order for foreign companies to sell their goods in our country, they would have to pay a fee to the national government. That's that tax. It's called a tariff. This would really benefit American industries who were just starting out, and since they didn't have to pay this extra tax, they were able to sell their goods for a lower price to the people of the nation. So these were also considered protective tariffs. I do want to note, however, that Southern farmers did not like this tariffs because then it actually hurt them and their trade with foreign countries, because then those foreign countries would put a greater tax on their goods when they're trying to ship it to them. It would also make supplies more expensive for them. However, tariffs alone was not going to be enough to pay for this national debt. Alexander Hamilton also proposed a tax on luxury goods like wine, spirits, and whiskey. Though today we may agree and say that, oh yeah, that's a luxury that we don't need. It was actually not a luxury for a lot of farmers, especially the farmers in Western Pennsylvania, where they relied on whiskey as money. Their crops, their grains like corn, wheat, and barley was very expensive to transport. So what they would do is they would distill it down into the whiskey form, which was a lot easier to move around and transport. They even used it as money because it was more plentiful than money in those parts. So a lot of people were actually protesting this part of his plan. It even caused a national crisis called the Whiskey Rebellion, where George Washington and Alexander Hamilton actually had to march the national militia down into Pennsylvania to quash it, though no fighting actually occurred. I mean, they just had to walk in and everyone saw George Washington and they were like, woo, George Washington, yay, there's no rebellion here. The rebellion was squashed dead. And finally, the last major part of Alexander Hamilton's solution to this giant debt was to create a national bank. His thinking was that, hey, we're collecting all of this money. We need to put it somewhere. Let's put it in a bank, in our own bank. And in the meantime, that bank with the money there, instead of just the money sitting there, that bank can actually give out loans to people. And that way, the money will keep circulating in the economy. It's good. In addition, this bank can also just print money whenever we need it. Right? Oh boy. People did not like that. In particular, Madison and Jefferson were extremely alarmed. This is actually the straw that broke the camel's back between James Madison and Alexander Hamilton's relationship. Remember, they worked together to write the Federalist Papers in order to push the Constitution through. Well, with this creation of the National Bank, Madison thought that, oh my gosh, this is not where I thought this would be going. And eventually, James Madison would partner with Thomas Jefferson to actively foil Alexander Hamilton's plans. And we'll talk about that at a later video. And after heated debates in Congress, the bill narrowly passed and it ended up on George Washington's desk to be signed. And before he signed this bill or veto it, he actually asked for input. He asked Thomas Jefferson what he thought. And Thomas Jefferson, in a very long letter, said that no way, this is not a power that the Constitution gave to the national government. The Constitution did not give the national government power to create this bank. So doing so would be an egregious, a terrible overreach of power by the national government. What else is going to keep the national government then from doing other things that the Constitution doesn't give it power to do? Amendment 10 specifically says that whatever powers the Constitution doesn't give to the national government belongs to the state government. So the state governments should be handling this. There should be no such thing as a national bank. Eventually, this type of reading the Constitution, where we're looking just specifically at what the Constitution explicitly says and explicitly gives power to the national government, that's called strict construction. And that's the type of interpretation that Jefferson and Madison decided to go with at this time. When they become presidents, it's it's going to be a little bit different. Anyway, after Washington received Jefferson's letter, he also went ahead and asked Hamilton for his input. And Hamilton responded to Jefferson's letter saying that, hey, actually, I think the Constitution is giving the government implied powers, right? Because taxing and collecting money is a power that the Constitution gave to the national government. Well, then how will the national government do that? And where will it put the money? A national bank is related to that power that the Constitution explicitly gave to the national government. Therefore, then, it's an implied permission, an implied power that the Constitution is giving to the national government. And this type of interpreting the Constitution eventually becomes known as loose construction, where they say, hey, whatever the Constitution doesn't specifically forbid the national government to do can be done if it's relevant. And after receiving Hamilton's response, Washington, with some reluctance, went ahead and signed the bill and created a national bank. So Alexander Hamilton's solution to the national debt was a really good thing because it actually bolstered the national credit. And now that creditors knew that the American government intended to pay off its debts and had a plan to do so, they were willing to lend it even more money. And it made more capital available for not just the government, but also American merchants and businesses. However, Alexander Hamilton's plans also created a very strong, solid central government. And you'll see this created a rift within the government, within the leaders, that the founding fathers did not foresee. And that is political parties, which will be the subject of our next video. I'll see you next time.